There is a place on Earth where 21 miles of water can affect the price of gasoline, diesel, airplane tickets, food, and almost everything that moves. And right now, that tiny stretch of water has become one of the most dangerous places on the planet. Because when ships stop moving here, the entire world starts paying. This is the Strait of Hormuz. And what happens next could affect millions of people who have never even heard of it. Look at a map of the Middle East. You will find Iran on one side, Oman and the United Arab Emirates on the other. Between them is a narrow waterway, the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, it is only around 21 miles wide. That doesn't sound impressive. But this tiny passage is one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. Before the current crisis, around 1/5 of the world's oil supply passed through this area. And it isn't just oil. Huge amounts of liquefied natural gas also move through the region. So imagine a highway, except instead of cars, you have giant oil tankers. And instead of thousands of alternative roads, there are very few practical alternatives. That's what makes Hormuz so powerful. But here's the part most people don't realize. The oil doesn't have to disappear for the world to experience a fuel shortage. It only has to stop moving. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Normally, this waterway is incredibly busy. Tankers enter, tankers leave. Oil moves toward Asia. Gas moves toward global markets. The entire system depends on this constant movement. But now, that movement has slowed dramatically. According to ship tracking data reported by Reuters, fewer than 20 commodity vessels crossed the strait over the weekend. Only 4 crossed on Sunday. 13 crossed on Saturday. And weekly traffic was roughly 90% below pre-conflict levels. Some ships have even switched off their tracking systems, so the exact numbers are uncertain. Think about that. A global energy highway, operating at a fraction of its normal traffic. And every hour that passes creates another problem, because oil isn't only something you put into a car. It is the beginning of a gigantic chain. And if one link breaks, the consequences spread. But first, we need to understand something. Why can't the world simply use another route? You might be thinking, why don't the tankers just go around? Simple question. Very complicated answer. Geography. The Persian Gulf is surrounded by countries. The Strait of Hormuz is the main maritime exit. There are pipelines that can bypass part of the route, but pipelines have limits. They cannot instantly replace the enormous amount of oil normally moved by sea. And even when alternative routes exist, they cost more, they take longer, and they may not have enough capacity. So the world doesn't have a magic second Hormuz. There is no giant backup highway waiting nearby. And that's why this tiny stretch of water matters so much. But there is another problem. Even if oil manages to get through, the story isn't over. Because crude oil is not the same thing as gasoline. This is where the crisis gets interesting. When you hear oil supply, you might imagine gasoline sitting inside a tanker. But crude oil isn't gasoline. Crude oil has to be transported, then refined, then separated into different products. Gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, petrochemicals, and countless other products. So imagine the global fuel system like a factory. Crude oil is the raw material. Refineries are the factories. Ships are the delivery trucks, and gas stations are the stores. Break one part, and the whole system starts struggling. And right now, the refining system is under serious pressure. Reuters reports that Asian imports of refined products such as diesel, gasoline and jet fuel are around 21% below pre-conflict levels. That means the real shortage isn't simply there isn't enough oil. It's more complicated. There isn't enough of the right fuel in the right place at the right time. And that's when the crisis reaches ordinary people. Imagine you're driving to work. You stop at a gas station, the price is higher. You complain. You fill the tank anyway. But you don't see what happened before that moment. The fuel may have traveled thousands of kilometers. Crude oil came from one country. A tanker carried it through a choke point. A refinery processed it. Another ship may have transported the refined fuel. A truck delivered it to your local station. Every step costs money. Every delay costs money. Every extra kilometer costs money. And when fuel becomes more expensive, the effect doesn't stop at the gas station. A truck needs diesel. The truck carries food. The supermarket sells the food. A farmer needs fuel for machinery. A factory needs energy. An airline needs jet fuel. A delivery company needs gasoline or diesel. So, suddenly, oil becomes food prices. Oil becomes transportation costs. Oil becomes airline tickets. Oil becomes inflation. And that is why a crisis thousands of kilometers away can reach your wallet. But there's an even bigger danger. What happens if the disruption continues for months? Fortunately, the world isn't completely helpless. Countries maintain emergency oil reserves. Companies hold inventories. Some producers can increase output. Some tankers can use alternative routes. And governments can release strategic stocks. These reserves act like a giant emergency battery. When supply falls, countries can use stored oil to buy time. But there is a problem. A battery eventually runs down. Reuters reports that global inventories have already been heavily depleted during the crisis, while emergency reserves have been drawn down to cushion the disruption. And once inventories become low, the market becomes much more nervous. Because the world is no longer asking, can we survive a few days? It starts asking, what happens if this continues? And that question changes everything. Oil markets don't only react to what is happening, they react to what investors think might happen next. That's extremely important. Imagine the world currently needs 100 units of oil, but traders believe future supply might fall. They don't wait until the shortage arrives. They start buying now. Prices rise. Companies begin protecting supplies. Countries compete for cargoes. And suddenly, fear itself becomes part of the price. Brent crude has recently traded around the low 90s per barrel after reaching significantly higher levels earlier in the crisis. And that creates a strange situation. Oil prices don't need to reach record highs for consumers to feel pressure, because fuel markets are connected to everything. And there is another problem hiding underneath the headline oil price: refineries. Here's something most people never think about. A refinery cannot necessarily turn any crude oil into any fuel at the same cost. Different crude oils have different characteristics. Some are heavier, some are lighter. Some contain more sulfur. Refineries are designed around specific types of crude, so imagine suddenly losing access to the type of oil your refinery was built to process. You might still have oil available somewhere else, but that doesn't mean you can immediately replace it. This is one reason the current crisis is more complicated than simply counting barrels. Reuters reports that refining margins have remained extremely high, while shortages of particular Middle Eastern crude grades are creating additional pressure on fuel production, so the world can have crude oil and still struggle to produce enough diesel, enough gasoline, enough jet fuel. That's the hidden bottleneck. But now comes the question everyone should be asking. Why is Hormuz so difficult to replace? The Strait of Hormuz sits between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Inside the Persian Gulf are some of the world's biggest oil-producing countries: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Iran itself. Much of the energy produced there has to pass through this narrow gateway to reach global markets. That's why Hormuz has been described as a choke point. Imagine squeezing a massive river through a narrow pipe. The river can contain enormous amounts of water, but the pipe determines how much can actually pass. That's Hormuz. And right now, that pipe is under extraordinary pressure. Reuters reported today that Iran has blacklisted 45 tankers, threatening fines, detention or cargo confiscation for vessels it says violated its transit rules. That means the problem isn't simply economics anymore. It's security, it's politics, it's military power. And that creates the biggest question of all. What happens if the disruption lasts another week, another month, or even longer? First, inventories continue falling. Then refiners compete for crude. Fuel prices rise. Transportation becomes more expensive. Businesses pass those costs to consumers. Inflation increases. Central banks face a difficult choice: raise interest rates to fight inflation, or tolerate higher prices to protect economic growth. And then comes the global divide. Rich countries can usually pay more. Poorer countries cannot. That means the same crisis can have completely different consequences depending on where you live. A wealthy country might pay more for fuel. A poorer country might face actual shortages, and that's already becoming visible. Reuters reports that the decline in refined fuel imports has been particularly severe for some less wealthy Asian economies. But there is one more piece of this puzzle: China. China is one of the world's biggest oil consumers, and it has been a major buyer of Iranian crude. But sanctions, shipping restrictions, and the wider conflict are making those flows much more complicated. Reuters reported today that Iranian shipments to China had fallen to around 534,000 barrels per day in August, down from about 823,000 barrels per day in July. And China isn't just another customer. What happens to China's oil demand affects global prices. If China buys more, prices can rise. If China buys less, prices can fall. So now we have a chain connecting Iran, Hormuz, China, refineries, tankers, gas stations, and ultimately, you. The strangest thing about this crisis is that it isn't really a story about oil. It's a story about dependence. Modern civilization is built on enormous supply chains. We don't think about them until they break. A ship gets delayed. A refinery loses crude. A country loses fuel. A truck becomes more expensive. A supermarket raises prices. An airline raises ticket prices. And suddenly, something happening in a 21-mile stretch of water becomes part of everyday life around the world. That's the power of a choke point. The world doesn't necessarily need to run out of oil. It only needs the oil to stop moving. And that's why the Strait of Hormuz matters. Because sometimes the most important places on Earth aren't the biggest. They're the narrowest. So the next time you see the price of gasoline rise, remember the journey behind it. a refinery, a tanker, a narrow sea, and a global system that depends on all of them working together. The Strait of Hormuz is only a tiny line on the map, but right now, that tiny line is being watched by the entire world. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Past Unlocked History and comment below. Do you think the world is too dependent on a few strategic places like Hormuz? Because history has shown us something. When a choke point breaks, the consequences can travel much farther than the water itself.